the foundations of Trinitarianism, at least in the way the scholars see it, has been for a long time wrongly assumed to be external or somehow disconnected from the religion of the Second Temple era, which is really the foundation of all religions that came after its destruction. But this book is one among a few that sets out to demonstrate that this is not really the case, and in my opinion breaks open the entire discussion on history and Christianity itself, and posits the notion that Trinitarianism in particular is not that new of a concept after all. And I will give you some details on the book and hopefully inspire you to grab it and further engage the ideas contained therein. So stay tuned. Welcome to biblioCultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video. Doing all these things helps the channel out, and if you like what I'm doing here, I will appreciate it. Also, I'll put here in the bottom and on the side my socials, my Ko-Fi account where you can tip the channel, you can do recurring tips, or you can do a single tip, and I also will put my X below. So again, if you want to comment on the video, send me a message, share the video, any of these things will help me, and I just want to thank you for it. And those that already do these things, I really appreciate it. You're really helping out the channel and hopefully increase the engagement of these kinds of serious topics. In this episode, I'm going over The Two Powers in Heaven by Alan F. Segal, and this edition is from 2012, Baylor University Press. You can find any edition out there. The one I have is a soft cover. I think there is a hardcover, I'm not sure. Like I always say, content is king, and in the case of this kind of book, I wish it had a lot more popularity, because I think it's such an important book. It would literally change your entire perspective on Christianity and of history. And unfortunately, these kinds of books don't have enough bookshelves to inhabit. And hopefully this review will encourage you to change that and add it to your collection. Now, the author makes it clear that he began studying the topic because he got interested in a particular heresy that he saw being described in certain rabbinical traditions. And he found it curious because it kept coming up, especially at the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. The rabbis kept mentioning the two powers in heaven, or dualism, bitheism, and he decided to go into this topic and study it because he also saw Christianity as being one of the targets of criticism, but the criticism was being directed at other groups, and he found that to be curious. Was this actually a continuation of a particular theological position that was already present in the Second Temple religion, sometimes called Second Temple Judaism? So that's the beginning of the engagement. Now, the author points out that scholars seem to be unaware of the vast variety of schools of thought and of mysticism that were present during the Second Temple era. So folks like the Merkabah, who later influenced movements like the Kabbalah, for example, already hypostasized the divine names and spoke in a way that is quite similar to other groups, including ancient Christianity. And I think this viewpoint is quite prevalent. I think that many people incorrectly believe that somehow the forefathers of both the Christians and Rabbinical Judaism were somehow a monolithic and Unitarian movement. So they, for some reason, seem to visualize a very unified system being present during the time of Christ himself, even though the New Testament is quite clear that that was not the case. If you just read the New Testament, a very obvious situation comes up. You have a lot of different groups, because you have the Samaritans, you have the Sadducees, Pharisees, and these other groups, including the group that follows Christ, as rebellious or contrary to or critical of the normative establishment, which itself is kind of divided in groups as well, actually. So I think the perception is based more on a presupposition, on an ideal conception of the world, and not really on the evidence, nor in scripture itself, which clearly posits a different scenario. But the other presupposition is that somehow these folks were Unitarian monotheists, to use a generic terminology. The term monotheism is a new term. It didn't exist in the ancient world, so it doesn't really apply to people in the past. But we can use it as a descriptor, just like the term Unitarian, which would have been foreign to the people in the past. But to us, what we mean by that term is that people assume that Second Temple Judaism were all in agreement that there's only one single solitary God that only manifests in a singularity, in a Unitarian form, and they didn't have concepts like hypostatic union, for example, in which you may have a single deity, but you may have persons that manifest from within the same essence, kind of like the view of Christianity, but that also existed in other groups. And this whole book is aimed at proving that point. For example, the Dead Sea sectarians, which are also another type of dualists, opens up the debate on their canon. Another very important personality will be Philo, who also viewed God as a single essence, but they had different hypostases, manifestations, and many different schools of thought, and many prominent ones within the religion of the Second Temple, viewed a lot of complicated passages in the Old Testament as evidencing that God had one essence, but he manifested in different persons. But we have to be careful with this, because at the end of the day, the term logos is used in the Septuagint, and the Septuagint was used by many different schools at the time prior to the first century, and the term logos was utilized freely. So not necessarily because they are using terms like theon or kyrios or logos means that they're using it in the same way as a Hellenized philosopher. And the way that Mr. Segal goes to study this issue is by analyzing a group of midrash studies of certain biblical passages that point out a possible hypostasis of Yahweh being manifested as the Ancient of Days. Now, interesting for me is that many of these rabbis, while trying to make sense of these passages, would interpret verses in the same way as the fathers of the church, except that the rabbis would try to somehow make sense of them, minimizing the obvious presence of different hypostases. To make the point, let me quote a particular section of the book. Quote, "The Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael, in comparison to the Mechilta of Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai, has developed an elegant argument based on the unstated rabbinic doctrine of the two attributes of God. This rabbinic doctrine derives two different aspects of God, one merciful and the other just, from the two Hebrew names of God, Yahweh and Elohim. Through Exodus 20 verse 2, the first line in the Ten Commandments, since it contains both Hebrew names, proves not only that one God was present, but that he was present on Sinai in both his just and his merciful manifestations. The complete argument allows that God can appear in different manifestations, either as a just or as a merciful God, or as both, but that it is always the same God, and that he was present in both his manifestations when he gave the Torah to Israel." So you can see there a very important theological issue that is always present is how to manage the one essence of God with his various attributes. If the attributes are different, like just and merciful, then that means that God has two hypostases. That is usually the consequence, and this is why divine simplicity tries to simplify this by saying that the attributes are the same with each other and with the essence to somehow ameliorate the conflict. But here the rabbis are tackling the issue by separating them, and that to me is fascinating and very important to understand. Something that is also quite important to understand is that a lot of these Mishraic criticism of Samaritans, Essenes, and by consequence the Christians is the issue of God being the author of evil, not only good. You see, in a lot of these different schools of thought, like the Samaritans and the Christians and the Essenes, God is only the author of good, and evil has to be explained some other way. So for example, you could argue that evil is the voidness of the good, the lack of good, separation from God, etc. This is usually how the problem of evil is answered in most of these schools. But for Rabbinical Judaism, which developed post most of these groups, to them it was crucial to preserve the absolute sovereignty of God, that he would also be the author of evil. So therefore, God is the author of evil and good, and this opens up a big can of worms, because if your God is also the author of evil, it lends itself to the position that evil is part of God's essence. Then you would have to redefine evil, and either you become a relativist or you accept evil as being essentially good. It basically inverts everything, and it creates a lot of problems. And I think this would be a very interesting criticism of Rabbinical Judaism itself, or of any hardcore form of monotheistic Unitarianism. And as a matter of fact, in relation to this, let me read a quote that I think will clarify this even further. And this is from Mishnah Sanhedrin 4, verse 5, which is the Talmud. Quote, "Therefore, but a single man was created in the world to teach that if any man has caused a single soul to perish from Israel, Scripture imputes it to him as though he had caused the whole world to perish. And if any man saves alive a single soul from Israel, Scripture imputes it to him as though he had saved alive a whole world. Again, for the sake of peace among mankind, that none should say to his fellow, 'My father was greater than your father,' also that the heretics should not say, 'There are many ruling powers in heaven.'" Now that verse is very important for a variety of interesting reasons. One of them is because you see they're trying to somehow make sense of good and evil within a single solitary unity of a deity. The other thing that's interesting is that this verse is actually paraphrased or directly quoted, depends how you look at it, in the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, which is 532. And obviously, this is interesting because Islam comes post Rabbinical Judaism, which is itself post-Christianity, which itself is post-Second Temple Judaism. And you see a development in rabbinical studies to make everything more monotheistic and more Unitarian. And now you have the Quran, which is a quintessential religion that reflects this, citing the Talmud to make the case about the unity of God. And as we know, this clearly is very similar to Rabbinical Judaism. That's why some people say that Islam is Rabbinical Judaism for non-Jews. And I'm just pointing out the citation. I'm simply saying that it is fascinating. I don't think it's a defeater for Islam, because the Quran could cite whatever it wants as a proof text. So nothing weird about it, but it is interesting that it's connected to a particular sectarian viewpoint of the Old Testament, trying to interpret everything as being Unitarian, even though most of the schools of thought in Second Temple Judaism were not of that style. And that's one of the errors that a lot of modern Christians make, especially the Protestant types, which look at Rabbinical Judaism of today, and without knowing it's a new religion, they think that Second Temple and First Temple Judaism was like that, when it wasn't. Because you had a lot of different schools of thought, and many of them believed in hypostasis, believed in one essence with different persons in God, and this was not an issue. So therefore, it's important to be aware of that. It doesn't matter where you stand on the issue. Another issue that complicates things is the way that the Midrash speculates on how Yahweh possibly could include his court with angels like Gabriel and the divine essence, etc. Meaning the possibility that a lot of the rabbis were considering, the name Yahweh itself was not a singularity, but a collective, which already the term Elohim is a collective, but here Yahweh is considered to be possibly a collective that includes his court, etc. So again, very different from what we in the modern world think that a lot of the ancient Jews believed. Even in the rabbinical literature, they even consider that as a possibility, which changes the game a lot. This book also has a very cool list of passages that complicate things, that are highly discussed and problematic within rabbinical Judaism, because they posit Yahweh as having a human body, or a human form at least, the angel of Yahweh, sharing the worship, the power, even enthronement. And for Christians, that's no problem, because for Christians, they resolve that by saying it's Christ. That's why when you study the Old Testament, especially from the traditional Orthodox point of view, Christ is everywhere in the Old Testament because he is that hypostasis. He is the one that appears in those theophanies, the one in human form, the one that wrestles, the one that speaks face to face, etc. The angel of the Lord that receives worship. So these same verses that are used as proof texts for Christ in the Christian world are actually the same ones that are being discussed by Rabbinical Judaism as problematic texts, and they're trying to resolve the issue. And just that is fascinating. Now, like I mentioned, Philo is very important historically because he was accused of being the founder of a form of Hellenized Judaism, but Philo is also reflecting an older tradition. And I'm going to quote from him real quick. "Most excellently and veraciously this oracle was given by God. For nothing mortal can be made in the likeness of the Most High, one and Father of the universe, but only in that of the second God, who is his Logos. For it was right that the rational part of the human soul should be formed as an impression of the divine Logos, since the pre-Logos God is superior to every rational nature. But he who is above the Logos exists in the best and in a special form." So, clear Logos theology, but like I said, it pre-existed Philo, but the wording is very similar to Christian wording, but it's not because Christianity is some kind of Hellenized concoction. It's because these thoughts and these arguments pre-existed Hellenization, at least to some level, because some academics argue that Hellenization occurred hundreds of years before. And if that's the case, then it would be a moot point to argue that Christians are the only ones Hellenized, because that would apply to everyone. All Second Temple Judaism would be tainted by Hellenization anyway. So usually when they accuse Christianity of being Hellenized, they're making a specific direct accusation in contrast to everyone else, as if they are in their own world, and that wouldn't really be historically accurate. The author also gives an excellent footnote that clarifies that the term melech, angel, messenger, could apply to prophets, kings, and the righteous in general during the time of the religion of the Second Temple, which opens up a door that is also controversial, in which people can be promoted to be angelic beings and therefore have a lot of power and influence and be part of the court of Yahweh. And if that's the case, then the criticism of saints in Christianity would be ridiculous, because it's the same doctrine. And again, it would prove the fact that it's not a brand new creation, but that the Second Temple Judaism that we consider to be somehow isolated or pure from this influence would be incorrect. So all in all, this book is crucial if you want to understand and if you want to develop a historically accurate viewpoint about the past. It shatters a lot of modern myths about some kind of perfectly coherent and normative form of Second Temple Judaism and even First Temple Judaism, and displacing it with a more nuanced and sophisticated view, which is the fact that you had a lot of schools of thought at the time, and that most of them were tackling with the same verses that clearly indicate a single essence of God, but with a variety of manifestations that would have to be somehow understood as a variety within the unity, and that hardcore Unitarianism was not that common, and it developed hundreds of years post the Second Temple. And this is important to understand current history, Protestantism, Islam, etc., because they hold that position, at least in some way, and you can trace the genealogy of this directly to these debates. So doesn't matter what religion you belong to, if you read this book, you're going to derive a lot of benefit. Because if you're making the incorrect argument about the historical novelty of Christianity, you would have to change that argument because it's not a good one. You can criticize Christianity in some other way or criticize Islam in a different way, but knowing the history is important no matter your position. To me, it clearly indicates that Christianity is obviously a continuation of Second Temple Judaism. It's not a brand new concoction, and that to me was significant because without knowing this, your viewpoint is quite distorted, and it has, I think, even doctrinal and philosophical consequences that are pretty bad for understanding the history of humanity and of religion. So anyway, hopefully you enjoyed the review. I try to make it as short as possible, but it is an important topic. You can either get the book online, or at least from this review, you got some basics of it, and hopefully it helps you in your journey and to understand these things better. So please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Doing these things really helps the algorithm, and it helps out the channel, and I appreciate it. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.